So we've talked about cloud deployment models like public clouds, private clouds, hybrid and community clouds. What follows after that are the services running within the cloud environment, or at least the services that are available for you to run. Now we're talking then about cloud service models. So these are categories of cloud service offerings. Now, depending on the specific service model will determine who is responsible for what. So imagine, for example, that you're deploying a virtual machine in the cloud. Well, you are responsible for that virtual machine's configuration. You can start and stop it. You're also responsible for applying patches. The provider's not going to do that, but the cloud provider in that example would be responsible for the underlying hardware that allows you to launch a virtual machine. But there are some other services where the responsibility will shift, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we get through these service models. So let's start off generic as in umbrella term. Anything as a service is called XaaS. All that this means is we have some kind of a service available over a network running on somebody else's equipment. And of course, it adheres to all of the standard cloud computing characteristics like pooled resources, rapid elasticity, metered usage, all of that good stuff. Now, there are three common cloud service models we're going to talk about. They are IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service, PaaS, Platform as a Service, and SaaS, Software as a Service. There are many other designations for service models, but these are the most common ones. So let's start with Infrastructure as a Service. Think of the name, underlying infrastructure. What do I need, for instance, to support an application that's important for the business? Well, I need storage. I need a network. I need at least a server. That's all infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure as a service, that's exactly the type of thing that we're talking about deploying in the cloud environment. So when it comes to things like virtual machines running in the cloud, we know that they are accessible in many different ways, and we should not make them publicly visible with the public IP. So with infrastructure, the CSP, the cloud service provider, is responsible for the underlying physical infrastructure, but we are responsible for deploying the virtual machine, or for deploying a storage account, or for configuring a virtual network in the cloud. That's infrastructure as a service. Let's take a look at how we might deploy some infrastructure in the Microsoft Azure cloud. Storage is infrastructure, so what I'm going to do in this case is deploy a storage account. One thing I want you to keep in mind is how incredibly simple this is compared to the equivalent if you had to do everything yourself on premises with physical storage arrays. So to get started here in the Azure portal, I'm going to click Create a Resource in the upper left. And I know I want to create a storage account, so I'm just going to type in Storage Account, and I'll select that from the drop-down list. Then I'll click on Create. Really, the only thing I have to concern myself with is what I want to call the storage account, the geographical region where I want it deployed, things like, do I want very fast storage or slower for archiving perhaps? Anything that's fast is going to cost more money. So I'm going to deploy this into a resource group called Project X. I'm going to call this storage account, store account, let's say Y8Z456. Make sure you adhere to company naming conventions. We don't want random names made up by various cloud techies. That gets confusing. I'm going to deploy this in Canada East. I can choose premium performance, which uses underlying solid state drives. It's going to cost me more money. I'm not going to bother with that. I can also configure replication if I want to replicate this data to a secondary geographical region for safekeeping. I'm just going to leave it on the default read access geo-redundant storage. So a read-only copy will be replicated to another region. When I click Next for networking, I can, from a security perspective here, say, look, right now, public endpoint is enabled. That means anybody potentially on any network, including the internet, can at least try to get into this storage account. Is that what you really want? Well, it depends on the need, but let's say it's not. So what I might do is say, no, private endpoint. And then down below, what I could do is say, look, I'm going to add a virtual network that I might already have defined in the cloud, where virtual machines there should be allowed to access this virtual network, but not any other networks, and certainly not the internet. So we have options in the cloud to configure those aspects of security. However, I'm just going to leave it on public endpoint all networks for this demo. Then when I go to next data protection, we can enable things like soft deletion if we delete files stored in the storage account. I'm just going to advance to review and create, the button in the bottom left. We don't have to configure anything else for the storage account. And then I'll click the create button in the bottom left. So you can imagine that if we weren't discussing some of those options, how incredibly quick and easy it is, especially when you get used to it, to deploy cloud storage. Now, how much space can I use? Virtually unlimited. You can specify a hard stop limit, but that's the great thing about the cloud, isn't it? One of the characteristics is rapid elasticity. The next cloud service model is Platform as a Service, PaaS. Now, if we think about what this means, we have some kind of a platform. Well, what's that? That could be a database platform. It could be a software developer platform. One of the benefits of PaaS in the cloud is we don't have to concern ourselves with the underlying complexities. Like, oh, I need to deploy a virtual machine to support a database. I need to install database software. No, with Platform as a Service, that's done for you. This is often also called a managed service. In the cloud, a managed service means that the cloud service provider manages all the mundane underlying setup requirements. In this case of databases, all you do is concern yourself with naming a database and tables and getting data into it and configuring database security. You don't have to worry about the underlying virtual machine or the database software. So not only is this called a managed service, sometimes it's even called serverless. Well, wait a minute. Isn't there a server running this somewhere? Of course there is. But you don't have access to it and you don't have to worry about it. Hence, serverless. So it could be databases like Microsoft Azure SQL databases, which are very quick and easy to deploy in the cloud. Or as we mentioned, it could be software developer tools like deploying function applications in the cloud where you can write your own code without having to set up the environment to do that. Isn't that one of the great things about the cloud? It's so quick and easy to do anything. The next cloud service model is Software as a Service, or SaaS, S-A-A-S. This is usually end-user productivity software. So it's not infrastructure, it's not a database platform or anything like that. This means that the responsibility of the cloud service provider, the CSP, is great. They're responsible for the underlying physical equipment, virtual machines that support whatever the end-user app is. Let's say it's Outlook.com, web-based mail. They're also responsible for making sure that software is loaded and available. Really, as a cloud tenant with SaaS, you're just responsible for configuring that end-user productivity software, like adding user accounts, enabling MFA on those user accounts, and configuring settings specific to this service offering. So it's important then to have a sense of the different categories of cloud service models when it comes to the Security Plus exam.